Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk about human factors and usability following the new ISO regulations and the FDA guidances. Let's start off with talking about why human factors has become very important to the FDA and to ISO. The FDA, by studying recalls and other incidents in the field for medical devices, has concluded that 1/3 of medical device incidents involve use errors, as opposed to device problems and failures. Over 1/2 of the device recalls involve the user interface. So the FDA has concentrated on human factors in the last few years. Now, some time ago, in July of 2000, in an FDA guidance, the FDA replaced the term user error with use error. Now, this is more than just a semantics change. It changes the emphasis. It removes the emphasis from the user to the device. So it's no longer an error by the user, it is a design error by the designer, which resulted in an error by the user. The QSR preamble also states that user error is considered to be a device nonconformity, because human factors should have been considered during the design phase. And another important point, that human factors is considered by the FDA to be part of a design control program. You cannot have a complete design control program without considering human factors as part of your design. Now, the IEC in 60601 states manufacturers must demonstrate that their device enables users to perform tasks with little or no chance of an error that could cause harm to patients or themselves. So the IEC 60601, which is the electrical safety standard, discusses human factors. And another point, to get approval to market a Class 2 or Class 3 medical device, as part of the submission, there must be a human factors analysis. Let's go through some definitions, and then we'll get into the procedures. A use scenario. It's a brief description of the sequence of user-device interactions. It's a small story. Example, preparing an infusion pump for use is a use scenario. It's a small story of what you're doing. Now, tasks are steps within a use scenario. So a use scenario consists of several steps. Now, in our use scenario example, steps might be install the tubing set into the pump. The next step would be set the pump parameters. That's all in the use scenario of preparing the infusion pump for use. That's very important to define the use scenarios because they play an important part in the validation. Critical task is a user task which, if performed incorrectly or not performed, could cause serious harm to user, where the harm might include compromised medical care. So harm can be a harm directly to the user, or it could include compromised medical care or no medical care. How are we going to conduct the human factors analysis? Well, there's two documents that have been recently issued. There's an FDA guidance applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices, issued in late 2016. And there's an IEC document, 62366-1, Medical Devices Application of Usability Engineering to Medical Devices. Now, this document is a FDA-recognized standard. And the two documents are practically identical. There are a few differences between them, which I'll explain, but in the discussion following, what I'm saying applies to both documents. Now, EN 62366 is the European version of the IEC document, but its requirements are the same. There's no difference between the EN version and the IEC version. There are two terms that we should understand. They have different, the same meanings, but different words. The formative evaluation and preliminary analysis. These are tests and activities conducted throughout the design process. And then summative evaluation or validation. This is the final human factor usability test. So the IEC has a certain term and the FDA calls it a different term, but they have the same meaning. A summary of the process. Go through a quick summary and then get into detail. First, you want to identify and analyze, which means you identify the intended use of the device and the users of the device, the specific users of the device, and their characteristics of the users. We identify the use environment. We identify the use scenarios. We identify the risk of using the device. And we identify use errors and known issues. These may be from similar devices or from the literature. While this is all going on, the interface design is being conducted as part of the design process. We then evaluate. We conduct formative evaluations or preliminary evaluations of the interface and user. And this is conducted throughout development. And we modify the design or modify the requirements in response to evaluations. So we feed back the results of our human factors studies into the design process, and we change the design or we modify the requirements for the design depending on where we are in the design process. And finally, we validate. This is final testing by users in use environment. How will we do this? We're going to go through a series of analysis steps and create a series of documents leading up to the validation, which will use all the information that we've developed. The first is a usability file. We should create a usability file. And this is the location of all the applicable records and all the documents that pertain to the human factors study. It's part of the design history file. Now, as with the design history file, all the documents don't have to be located in this file directly, but there should be pointers or links to the documents in the file so that you can easily locate them. Start off with a usability plan. like any engineering design plan, is what is going to be done, by who, and when. We then create a use specification for the use of the device. We'll discuss how the device will be used, by who, and under what conditions, and who is affected by the device. Now this begins as a high-level document, and it becomes more detailed as the project progresses. So we will modify the use specification as we get smarter. We're going to conduct a human factors hazard analysis. This could be part of the device hazard analysis, or it might be a separate hazard analysis. From all of the above, we're then going to create a user interface specification. This is a technical specification for the user interface. And then a user interface evaluation plan. How are we going to evaluate the user interface? And again, this should be developed early and revised as the project progresses. The plan should include both the formative and summative studies, both the preliminary and the validation study. It's a plan for the entire human factors program. Next step is verification that the technical requirements have been implemented correctly, the validation, and then the final report. So let's start off with the usability plan, the first step. We start off with the list of analyses and studies to be conducted. And again, this is done early in the program and it's updated. We list the standards and guidelines that are going to be followed. All the FDA, ISO, IEC standards and guidance documents that will be used for requirements, design, and testing. We list the resources that we need and responsibilities of the people. Then we have a schedule for the program and milestones. And it's important that your plan shows how and when the results of the usability program, the intermediate results, factor back into the design. There should be a mechanism for this, for feedback into the design. There will be a verification and validation plan as part of the usability plan. And the training, if there is going to be training, should be discussed. Training for the patient, training for technicians, nurses, training for service personnel. The next document that we'll complete is the use specification. We start off with a description of the device, and a description of the intended use of the device, and then the medical indication, which is the health problem that the device treats, diagnoses, prevents, or monitors. Then the device application, its use environment, the range of the environments. Now, defining the use environment is important because it can affect how the people use the device. Is it a home use device? Is it a clinical use device? Is it used by medical professionals? Is it used by technicians? Is it used by patients themselves? Is it used by caregivers? It's important to define these up front. We define the user groups called the distinct user populations. The user group is a subset of intended users who are differentiated from other intended users by factors that are likely to influence usability. And what that means is you may have a group of adult people, you may have an elderly group, you may have lay people who are using the device and health professionals who are also using the device. The device may be used by pediatric, it might be used by adult people. It's important to define what groups are using the device, and it's important to define these up front because this affects the validation study. We'll discuss that in more detail later. Now, for each of these user groups, we define profiles of those users. Their age range, weight range, education that's necessary to operate the device, if there is a requirement for education, any experience, etc. And we want to put this information together because we use it for the validation testing. As part of the use specification, we now create the use scenarios that correspond to the user profiles. And the use scenario is a description of a user interacting with the device under specific conditions of use. It has user tasks. Now, the use scenarios could be different for different user groups. You must consider the environment and possible impairments of people. You might have arthritic people who can't manipulate fingers and press buttons, as well as a general adult population. So it's important to define the user groups, the use scenarios, and the environments. A low light environment, like in a home, may prevent elderly people who might have impaired vision from seeing information on a screen. We then define potential use errors that could happen during the scenario. And one of the definitions is a hazard-related use scenario. When a use scenario is combined with a potential error which leads to a hazardous situation. It's a hazard-related use scenario. It's important to define these, identify these, because these will be part of the validation. We also define the user tasks. We define, and explain the tasks. We define the user performance that represents success for each task. And we define the potential use errors in each task. What could the user possibly do wrong in the task? We define the operating functions. For example, turning on the power, selecting a temperature. These must be in the validation test. And we define the user actions that are necessary for the operating functions. And we list these. For instance, we're going to flip a switch to turn on the power. I'm going to touch the screen to select the temperature. It's important to define and list these because we have to evaluate these against the user limitations that we've defined previously. Now, it sounds like a lot of detail, but as we get to the validation test, you'll see how important it is to do this work up front and get this information defined. We identify the critical tasks. And this can come from a hazard analysis, an FMEA, FDA, other types of risk analysis. Critical task is a user task which, if performed incorrectly or not performed, could cause serious harm to the user, where harm includes compromised medical care. And you can select critical tasks based on a severity ranking in a hazard analysis. The responses to alarms are considered critical tasks and would be part of the validation. In your specification, you should explain the process of how you selected these critical tasks. What was your criteria or your rationale for identifying critical tasks? You identify the use scenarios involving the critical tasks. So each critical task should have use scenarios related to it. You identify essential tasks. These are tasks necessary for successful use of the device, but they would not result in harm if they were performed incorrectly. It would mean that the device would not be used successfully, but there would be no harm to the patient or other user. We identify the safety-related interface characteristics and reasonably foreseen misuse. We brainstorm and think of how could the device be misused. And inputs to that are the FDA databases, recall databases, MDR databases, and feedback from post-market surveillance for similar devices. We conduct a usability hazard analysis. The objective is to identify and mitigate use-related hazards. Keep in mind that a device malfunction, a failure of the device, is not a use error. The FDA recommends that you use ISO 14971 to do the hazard analysis. It's an FDA-recognized standard. Now, unlike device hazard analysis described in ISO 14971, you do not consider probability. ISO 14971 combines probability and severity into a risk rating. The FDA feels, and IEC agrees, that it's very difficult to estimate the probability of a person committing a user error. So a usability hazard analysis considers only the severity of the harm that could result. The mitigations from your hazard analysis, they can become user interface design requirements. If you're in the design, it may be a design change. Could become a training requirement or a requirement on the user manual. Now you can use known problems as input to the hazard analysis. The FDA databases I mentioned are good sources. So use-related hazards, they occur for one or more of the following reasons. This is a list from the FDA. It's used in ways that were not anticipated. You didn't expect the user would do a certain action. Used in ways that were anticipated but inadequately controlled for. Requires physical, perceptual, or cognitive abilities that exceed those of the user. The user is an elderly person and has arthritis in his fingers, could not manipulate keyboard. And you have to think of these possibilities. Now here's an important point. Another hazard is uses inconsistent with the user's expectation or intuition about device operation. The user has a mental model about how the device should operate. An example is knobs on similar devices are turning clockwise to increase flow rate. In this new design, the knob turns counterclockwise to increase flow rate. Now, this is a simple-minded example, but it shows what could happen when you don't consider the mental model of the user. This is especially important when the user is under pressure. He would revert to his mental model rather than to the directions, the instructions for use. Another mental type hazard is what's called capture error. The user is working in a routine pattern, and the situation calls for a novel response that's different from the routine. And the user is captured by the routine and performs an incorrect action because he continues with his routine. Hazards can result from the use environment, low light, noise, distractions. Let's go through a couple of examples to illustrate the concept of hazard analysis. Our hazard by itself can't do any harm. It's an abstract hazard. An event causes a hazardous situation to occur, and the hazardous situation results in harm. That's the left-hand column. So a hazard might be attention failure. The event, a user fails to insert a medicine vial firmly during the pump setup. The hazardous situation is the medicine not being delivered, and the harm is patient injury. Or a second hazard would be overdose. The event or the cause, user installs tubing having larger bore than that's specified in the information for use. The hazardous situation, there would be a higher flow rate of drug than planned. Harm again, patient injury. Another overdose hazard. The event, the user fails to purge the pump before adding new drug. The hazardous situation would be prior drug delivered to the patient, and then the harm would be patient injury. So these are a few examples of a human factors hazard analysis. Once we've created all the previous information, we now create a user interface specification. The user interface specification defines all point of interaction between the user and the device. This includes the packaging, it includes the labeling, it includes the training. It's the technical requirements for the user interface. And as part of the specification, you develop the acceptance criteria. For example, the display text shall be readable at a distance of 3 feet. Is a requirement, and the acceptance is that it's readable. Some inputs to this user interface specification is the use specification that we just described, the hazard-related use scenarios that we discussed, and the hazard analysis, and the mitigations, and other preliminary or formative analyses that are conducted. The user interface evaluation plan. How are we going to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the user interface? Well, we have the formative evaluations or the preliminary evaluations. And these are analyses and studies conducted during development. It should include the user manual, the labeling and training program. Evaluations of these should be done early in the program, and as the user manual and training gets more detailed, evaluations updated. Now, an important point is that the formative evaluations or preliminary evaluations, the protocols, you must have protocols, but you do not need acceptance criteria. The point of these evaluations is to learn and to factor those learnings back into the design program. So these do not need acceptance criteria as typically technical evaluations would. The summative evaluation, the validation, is the final human factors study. As part of it, you do requirements verification, you do an interface validation, and you validate the hazard-related use scenarios. You validate the primary operating functions, the essential tasks, and the critical tasks that we've defined before. In this case, for validation, you do need acceptance criteria. Let's go through some preliminary analysis. Two types of preliminary analysis that you can do is analytic and there's empirical. Analytic, you can review the user action with the device, assess it. You can use market research data. However, keep in mind that market research data really focuses on personal preferences and satisfaction more so than user performance. It doesn't address how well the user operated the device, if he had any difficulties with it, etc. So it's helpful, but it's not sufficient. Empirical is derivation of data from users' experience with the device. These are things like focus groups. Now keep in mind, for empirical studies, you want to design these studies so there's no risk or harm to test participants. You cannot deliver any therapy to the participant. You don't want to be in a situation where you should have had an IRB for the analysis. So let's go through some analytical evaluation methods. Task analysis is a step-by-step description of the human-device interaction. Describes what the user is expected to perceive, understand, and physically manipulate. It's a detailed evaluation of each task. So for each task, you identify the task, the sequence of tasks, the timing of the task, the frequency. What user interface component is involved in doing the task? What information does the user need to perform the task? Where is he getting that information? What qualifications does the user need to have? What is the environment of the task? And what decisions must the user make when he's doing this particular task? And how does the device respond to the user for each task? Is there a feedback telling him that he's successful or unsuccessful? This critical task identification, where we identify the critical tasks and categorize them based on their severity. Action error analysis. We brainstorm user possible errors during use. This would be doing the right thing at the wrong time, the wrong thing at the right time, nothing at the right time, or something that is not required or expected. This is brainstorming. We list our use errors and the analysis. And an analysis of known problems. This can come from complaint files for similar products, from the FDA sites, from known problems with comparable devices, from predicate devices. You should describe the selection rationale and the types of devices examined, and describe how these analyses are factored into the hazard analysis. You can do a timeline analysis. This is important for complex systems. The timelines, they illustrate the sequential and the simultaneous responses required of the user. It shows the mental and the physical workload at any time. By doing this analysis, you'll discover if the user is faced with doing 4 or 5 tasks at more or less the same time, which could overwhelm him. You can do a design audit, comparing your design to lists of good design practices. And ISO HE75 is an excellent document for that comparison. Empirical methods. The focus group, where you observe the users operating the device. Now, this focus group is less formal than a validation focus group. In this study, you can use prototypes or currently marketed similar device. You're trying to learn about it. You should have a moderator. You should follow a documented script. So he always does the same thing to the same people. You test the use scenarios. You should simulate the user environment as realistically as possible. You conduct a post-test interview following the test of each participant. Now, these studies are done during development, and you'll do multiple studies. It's important that for each time you do a focus group study, you have new users. You want to avoid experience biases. You don't want people to get smarter. As to how many people, studies have shown 5 to 7 participants find 85% of human factors issues. So for these purposes, you can use 5 to 7 participants with good certainty of finding issues. Another method is a walkthrough. Participants verbalize their thoughts as they operate the device. And this is helpful because you're getting real-time thoughts, but it's limited by the lack of realism. It's an artificial situation. Verification step. In the verification, we test that the design output meets the design input. Test that all requirements have been implemented and that have been implemented correctly. Now, these are detailed technical tests, and these can be conducted on production equivalent devices by engineering personnel. You don't need to involve users or user groups for the verification. Strictly a technical test. Okay, validation, very important. It's important that you do lots of testing before the formal validation. The formal validation is a very extensive, very expensive test. You want to be sure that it's successful. Ideally, the validation should be the documentation of your successful development, that there are no surprises. Of course, ideal doesn't always work, and we'll address what happens when there's a problem during validation. The definition of validation, a human factors validation, is much different than a technical validation, software or hardware validation. The definition of a validation for human factors is that the device can be used by the intended users under expected use conditions without serious use errors or problems. And we'll go into detail on that. Now, the validation must include the actual device, its packaging, its labeling, and the training. Here's a very important point that must be adhered to. The FDA has rejected many validation studies because people did not address this. You must allow a dwell time between the training and testing. If you're giving the participants training, if training is going to be part of your offering, you must allow a dwell time between the time of training and the time of testing. It could be 1 hour, it could be several days. The point of dwell time is to allow the participant to forget what you've trained him on. And this is an idea to create realism. So you must allow a dwell time. You must document the rationale for why you chose the particular dwell time. The validation is observing the user operating the device. The moderator should follow a documented script. It's important to get a true validation. You emphasize to the user that the test is of device functionality, not the user performance. You want the participant to be relaxed, not to think that he is being judged. It's a test of the device. In the validation, you focus on critical tasks, essential tasks. You will introduce errors to test alarm response. How does the user respond to an alarm? What does he do? You simulate the use environment as realistically as possible, and you have a post-test interview. This interview should be conducted right after the test is completed. You should address in this interview difficulties, any confusion, any errors that's noticed, as well as failures. You want to consider problems or potential problems as well as absolute failures. You should get the participants' assessment of any root cause of difficulties. Don't rely on the designer's reasons for a problem or a difficulty or a failure. You should look at the emotional aspect. How does the device make the patient feel? Is he comfortable using it? Is he uncomfortable? This is important because that can affect performance, maybe not of this person, but of other people. If it makes one person uncomfortable, it could create errors in another person. Now, the test participants must represent actual users, and you must consider the environmental factors. Now, we've identified lots of use scenarios and tasks. Not all of these are necessary to be tested. All essential, all critical tasks must be tested. Tasks requiring response to alarms are critical tasks and must be tested. You should provide a rationale for the tests you've chosen. All hazard-related use scenarios are tested. Now, at the beginning of the validation, you give the participants the device as they would receive it in real life, in its original packaging, with all the documentation, labeling, the manuals. As far as labeling goes, it's given to the participants, but they are not instructed to use it. They use it if they feel they want to use it. Now, here's a very important point. Up to the time of the publication of these guidances in the IEC document, there was no definition of how many people are necessary for a study, validation study. Companies would ask the FDA, and they would say it depends, leaving it to the company to make a judgment about how many people, and hoping the FDA agrees with them when they submit this study. With this publication of the guidance, the FDA has defined the number of participants. They're saying there must be a minimum of 15 participants from each distinct user population. That's why I emphasized earlier that it's very important to carefully define the distinct user populations, which are the subsets of the user groups, of the users. Because 15 people adds up very quickly to a very long, expensive study. Now, as mentioned before, the population is distinct when their characteristics would likely affect their interactions with the device. So, for instance, healthcare providers and lay users might be distinct user populations, two distinct user populations, but they might not be. Depends on the specifics of the device. If there's a difference in how a healthcare provider or a lay user would use the device, they may be a distinct user population. If you cannot assemble 15 participants, you should document the rationale, and based on experience, it better be a good rationale. FDA expects 15 people. I had one situation where the device is used by highly skilled medical doctors, and it was just about impossible to find 15 people within a reasonable geographic area to do a study. And that was a good rationale. Company employees should not be test participants. They know too much. Also, the FDA has said participants must reside in the United States. The reasons: there are different clinical practices and different cultural factors outside the United States that could make the results invalid. Now, this is the FDA's criteria as published in their guidance. The IEC document does not specify a participant number. The MHRA also requires 15 participants. It agrees with the FDA document. Okay, let's look at a validation study itself. Data collection. You're having observation data. You're collecting data on the observation. There should be no interference from the test facilitator. There's also knowledge data, where you conduct tests on the participant's knowledge of the device, of using the device, and information about the device. There should be interview data collected following the test. It's important that the interview be done with open-ended questions, not closed questions. Example, you do not ask, did you see the light that tells you treatment was completed? You ask, how did you know treatment was completed? So the difference is you're not leading the participant into an answer, but you're evaluating, does he really know the information? Part of the validation, you analyze all use errors, all confusion, all close calls. Now, the use errors that did not result in any harm or potential harm need minimal analysis. Use errors that could result in serious harm need much deeper analysis. You should determine the root cause, not blame the participant for forgetting how to use the device. You should determine possible mitigations to these confusions, failures, etc. Now, what is a successful validation? Unlike a technical engineering validation, validation is not quantitative. You can't use numbers. You can't say 95% of the tests were successfully completed. Therefore, we validated the system. The validation success is a qualitative conclusion backed up by data. And the qualitative conclusion would be device has been found to be safe and effective for the intended users, uses, and use environments. Participants demonstrated a high level of success in using the device. Notice we use the term high level, not 100% or 80%, high level. No patterns of use problems were observed. Again, we're using the term patterns. Residual risk is acceptable. No design changes are necessary. Now, if you have a problem during the validation and you conclude you must modify the design somehow, you can do the design modification. Hopefully this is not the case because you've done enough preliminary studies that this doesn't happen, but if it does, you do the design modification and you retest only those aspects of the validation test that are affected by the redesign. You document your rationale. Residual risk, very important to address residual risk. All risks that remain following validation testing should be thoroughly analyzed to determine if they can be reduced or eliminated. And these residual risks must be disclosed in the labeling or training. Now, if you have serious use errors remaining following your analysis, you must do a risk-benefit analysis of the device. Determine if benefits of the device outweigh the residual risks. And hopefully they do. Otherwise, you have to cancel the project or redesign. Let's discuss the human factors report. The human factors report is not just a typical summary report. The human factors report is very important to the FDA. Not so much to IEC. IEC calls for a report, but the FDA emphasizes a report, and they give you in their guidance a detailed report template. You should follow it because that's how they're going to look at the data. I won't go through the detailed report because it's very clear in the guidance, but the key parts of the report are first the conclusion. You should discuss the adequacy of the design to support safe and effective use. Discuss how human factors was applied during development. As part of the conclusion, compare usability of known, say, predicate devices with the current device. You should show that known problems with comparable devices, these you identified earlier in the program, were evaluated and the new device protects against those problems. So it's a discussion. You must be able to reach a definite conclusion that the device has been found to be safe and effective, and back that up with data. Your report will have a results section and a residual risk analysis, and where your conclusion is that the residual risk is acceptable. You can use this report as part of your approval submission. As I said, IUC doesn't call for a very detailed report, doesn't emphasize that FDA does, and MHRA also does. Now here's a list of some references that are very good to have for your library. Now, human factors is part of design control. You must have a compliant design control program. They must have SOPs to control the design. Typical titles of the SOPs you should have: design and development process, document control and revision, change control. You should have a pre-release change control and also a post-release change control, SOP. SOP on design review, on the design history file, on how to create requirements or design inputs, your risk analysis program, how you're going to conduct the hazard analysis, your design outputs, guidelines on protocols and reports, design transfer, design verification, and design validation. Now, specific to the human factors, as part of design control, you should have SOPs on the usability plan, on how to develop the use specification, how to do a usability hazard analysis, how to develop the usability interface specification, the use interface evaluation plan, the design verification, how to conduct the usability validation, and how to create the final report.